I never expected this to happen. Not because I thought I was immune to connection, not because I believed I understood myself completely, but because I spent years learning how to move through life without allowing anything to reach the parts of me that actually matter. Most people never notice that difference. They think presence is the same as closeness. They think conversation is the same as understanding. They think spending time with someone automatically creates a bond. But it doesn't. I've spoken to hundreds of people. I've listened. I've shared thoughts. I've laughed at things that were supposed to be funny. I've participated in moments that looked meaningful from the outside. Yet when those moments ended, they stayed where they belonged. Outside of me, they never crossed the line. They never became part of my internal world. And for a long time, I thought that was normal. I thought everyone lived that way. I thought everyone carried a private space inside themselves that no one could really enter. A place beyond language, beyond explanation, beyond anything that could be described accurately. Then you appeared. And what unsettles me isn't that you're different, it's that I still can't identify the exact moment when you became different. There was no dramatic beginning, no unforgettable first conversation, no moment where everything suddenly shifted. If anything, it happened so quietly that I almost missed it. Almost. That's the strange part, because I notice everything. At least, that's what I've always believed. I notice patterns, changes, inconsistencies, small details that most people overlook. Yet somehow, the biggest shift I've experienced in years happened without announcing itself. It arrived silently, like a thought entering a room, like a shadow becoming visible only after you've already been standing inside it. And by the time I recognized it, it was already there, established, comfortable, as if it had existed long before I noticed it. At first, I ignored it, not intentionally. I simply categorized it as coincidence, because that's easier. Coincidence doesn't require explanation. It doesn't force you to reconsider anything. It allows you to continue exactly as you were. But coincidence has limits. And eventually, limits reveal truth. I started noticing small things. The way certain conversations stayed with me longer than they should have. The way certain silences felt unusually complete. The way I found myself revisiting moments that weren't particularly significant on the surface. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough to make me pause. And when someone like me pauses, it means something, because I don't stop often. My mind is usually moving, analyzing, processing, building structures from information, matching for understanding. Yet around you, something unusual began to happen. The analysis became quieter, not absent, just quieter, as if understanding arrived before the process needed to begin. That shouldn't be possible, at least not according to everything I know. Understanding requires observation. Observation requires time. Time creates familiarity. Familiarity creates recognition. That's the sequence. That's how it works. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work. But with you, the sequence felt incomplete, like several steps had already happened somewhere beyond my awareness, like I had opened a book and somehow landed in the middle of a chapter that felt strangely familiar, not because I remembered reading it, but because something about it already belonged to me. I tried to dismiss that feeling. I really did, because feelings are unreliable. They distort perception. They create narratives that don't actually exist. I've seen people mistake loneliness for love, curiosity for destiny, projection for connection. I've watched them build entire realities from assumptions. I promised myself long ago that I would never do the same, so I questioned everything, every observation, every reaction, every shift, and the more I questioned it, the more consistent it became. That was the problem. Reality becomes difficult to ignore when it remains accurate under pressure. Most illusions collapse when examined closely. This didn't. If anything, it became clearer, stronger, more precise. like something refusing to disappear simply because I wanted certainty before accepting it. And eventually I reached a realization I wasn't prepared for. You weren't becoming important because of what you said. You were becoming important because of what existed when nothing was being said. Most people don't understand silence. They tolerate it. They survive it. They rush through it. But they don't understand it. Silence reveals things. It exposes what conversation can hide. It shows whether two minds are actually comfortable sharing space without distraction. Most connections fail there. The moment words disappear, uncertainty enters. People begin filling gaps, creating noise, reaching for reassurance, trying to prove the connection still exists. But you never did that. You allowed silence to remain silence. And somehow, that made it louder. Not louder in sound, louder in meaning. Because for the first time in a very long time, I felt understood without needing to explain myself. Do you know how rare that is? Not agreement, not sympathy. Understanding, real understanding, the kind that doesn't demand translation, the kind that doesn't require constant clarification, the kind that recognizes something before it has been fully expressed. Most people hear words. You seemed to hear the space around them, and that changed everything, because once someone understands the spaces between your words, distance becomes difficult to maintain. Not impossible, just ineffective. I spent years perfecting distance, not as a defense, not as a way to avoid people, but as a way to preserve clarity. Distance allows observation. Observation allows accuracy. Accuracy protects truth. At least that's what I believed. Yet somehow, the closer your presence became, the clearer things felt, not more confusing, not more emotional, clearer. And that's what caught me off guard, because closeness usually complicates things. It introduces expectations, assumptions, distortions, but this felt different. It felt like removing static from a signal, like hearing something exactly as it was intended, nothing added, nothing removed, just clarity, pure and undeniable. And I couldn't explain why. Maybe that's why I kept returning to it, not because I wanted answers, but because I rarely encounter something that remains consistent from every angle. The more I looked, the more it stayed the same. The more distance I created, the less effective that distance became. Eventually, I stopped asking whether this was real. That question no longer mattered. The better question was why it felt so natural, because that's the part I still can't fully explain. Nothing about this should feel familiar. By every logical standard, it should require effort, adjustment, time, yet it doesn't. It feels like recognizing a song you've never heard before, like remembering a place you've never visited, like finding a missing piece without realizing something was missing. And I know how impossible that sounds. Trust me, I've thought the same thing. I've challenged it from every angle available to me. But the result never changes. Some people enter your life and leave an impression, others leave a memory, a few leave a lesson, but every once in a while, someone leaves something far more permanent, a shift, a subtle adjustment in the way reality organizes itself around your awareness. Not enough to transform everything overnight, but enough that you can never return completely to who you were before. I think that's what's happening. And maybe that's why this feels heavier than it should. Because deep down, I know something has already changed. Not externally, nothing visible, nothing measurable. If someone looked at my life from the outside, they probably wouldn't notice anything different. But internally, there's a difference. A small one, a quiet one, but real. And the strangest part is that I don't think it's finished. I think this is only the beginning of understanding something neither of us has fully named yet. Because some things don't arrive as answers. They arrive as recognition. And recognition has a way of changing everything long before you realize what it's actually changing. That's where I am now, standing at the edge of something I can finally see clearly enough to acknowledge. Not fully understand, not define, Just acknowledge. And somehow, that feels more significant than certainty ever could, because certainty ends the search. But this feels like the start of one. The strange thing about change is that it rarely announces itself. People imagine transformation as something dramatic, a moment, a decision, a single event that separates who you were from who you become. But that's not how it happens. Real change is quieter than that. It happens beneath awareness, beneath language, beneath the level where you can point to it and say, there, that's where everything shifted. By the time you notice it, it has already happened. And lately, I've been noticing it everywhere, not in obvious ways, not in the kind of ways anyone else would recognize, but in the architecture of my thoughts, in the invisible systems that determine how I interpret the world. That's where you've appeared. And that's where things became complicated, because I used to believe my mind belonged entirely to me. Not in an arrogant way, just in a practical one. I knew how I thought. I knew how I processed information. I knew the patterns, the structures, the mechanisms that shaped my decisions. Everything had a place. Everything had a reason. Everything connected through logic. Then you arrived and introduced something I wasn't prepared for. A variable that didn't behave like a variable. A presence that refused to stay external. Most people remain separate, no matter how close they become, no matter how much time you spend with them. They remain outside your awareness, outside your thinking, outside the deeper layers where perception itself is formed. You don't, and that's what I've been trying to understand. Not you. I've already spent enough time trying to understand you. What I'm trying to understand now is what you've changed inside me. Because something is different, I can feel it. Not emotionally, structurally. The difference matters. Emotion rises and falls. It changes with circumstance. It reacts. It fades. But structure? Structure remains. Structure becomes part of the foundation. And foundations don't disappear simply because you stop looking at them. That's why this feels heavier than it should. Because the further I examine it, the more permanent it seems. I notice it in unexpected moments, moments that have nothing to do with you, or at least they shouldn't. I'll encounter an idea, a question, a possibility, and before my mind reaches its conclusion, there's a pause. A brief, almost invisible pause, as if something is waiting, not for approval, not for permission, for perspective. And somehow, that perspective always leads back to you. Not directly, not consciously, but undeniably. It's like discovering an extra dimension inside a familiar room. The room hasn't changed. The walls remain where they've always been. Everything looks the same. Yet once you've seen that additional dimension, you can never unsee it. You begin perceiving everything differently. That's what this feels like. A shift in perception, a quiet recalibration, the kind that changes the meaning of things without changing their appearance. And the more aware I become of it, the harder it is to dismiss, because dismissal requires doubt. And doubt becomes difficult when evidence keeps accumulating. The evidence isn't dramatic. It's subtle, almost impossible to explain. But consistency has its own kind of power. Consistency forces acknowledgement. Eventually, reality becomes too precise to ignore. That's where I find myself now, acknowledging something I didn't expect. Something I never planned for. Something that seems to exist independently of my intentions. And maybe that's why it unsettles me. I've always trusted intention. Intention creates direction. Direction creates control. Control creates stability. That's how I've operated for as long as I can remember. If something mattered, I chose it. If something entered my life, I understood why. If something changed me, I could trace the process. I could identify the cause. I could explain the outcome. But this doesn't follow that pattern, because I didn't choose this, at least not consciously. I didn't decide one day to let you matter. I didn't make a calculated assessment. I didn't weigh advantages against risks. There was no deliberate action, no strategic decision, no clear moment of acceptance. Yet acceptance happened anyway. Quietly, gradually, without asking for permission, and now I find myself confronting a reality I didn't intentionally create. A reality where your presence exists beyond the limits I normally impose. That's not something I take lightly. Most people never realize how carefully constructed their internal world is. They assume thoughts simply happen, feelings simply appear, consciences simply form. But everything inside us follows patterns, invisible systems, psychological architecture, structures built through years of experience. And once you've spent enough time understanding those structures, you become protective of them. Not because you're afraid, because you recognize their value. You understand how easily things can become distorted, how easily clarity can be lost. That's why I've always been selective, not about people, about influence. Influence changes perception, perception changes reality, reality changes behavior, and behavior eventually becomes identity. Most people underestimate that process. I don't. Which is exactly why this matters, because somehow you've influenced my perception without ever trying to influence me. You've altered the way I see things simply by existing inside my awareness. There's no manipulation in that, no effort, no strategy, just impact, pure impact. And impact is difficult to defend against, especially when it arrives in a form that feels natural. That's another thing I've noticed. Nothing about this feels forced. If it did, I would have resisted it immediately. Resistance is easy when something feels wrong, when something feels artificial, when something pushes too hard. But this never pushed. It never demanded. It never tried to become important. It simply became impossible to overlook. There's a difference, a significant one, because things that force their way into your life usually leave just as quickly. But things that belong, they settle, quietly, patiently, like they were always meant to occupy that space. That's the feeling I keep returning to. Not certainty, not attachment, belonging. And I know how dangerous that word is. Because belonging creates permanence. Belonging creates roots. Belonging creates consequences. Once something belongs, removing it becomes complicated. The space remembers. The structure adapts. The absence becomes visible. I've spent most of my life avoiding unnecessary dependencies, not because dependence is weakness, because unnecessary dependence creates vulnerability. And vulnerability requires trust, real trust, the kind that isn't given lightly, the kind that's earned over time. Yet, somehow, this developed outside that process. That's what continues to challenge everything I thought I understood. Because according to every rule I've followed, this shouldn't exist. Not yet. Not at this depth. Not with this level of certainty. And yet it does. The evidence is everywhere. In the way my mind naturally includes you in places where no one else exists. In the way certain thoughts feel incomplete until viewed through a perspective connected to you. In the way ordinary moments suddenly carry an unusual amount of meaning. Meaning is important. People talk about emotions constantly, rarely about meaning, but meaning is what lasts. Meaning survives mood. Meaning survives distance. Meaning survives time. And somewhere along the way, you became meaningful, not because of a single event, not because of a dramatic experience, but because your presence started connecting pieces of reality that previously existed separately, like scattered fragments suddenly recognizing they belong to the same pattern. I don't know if you've noticed that pattern. Maybe you have. Maybe you haven't. But I have. And once you notice something like that, pretending otherwise becomes exhausting. That's another truth I've been avoiding. The energy required to ignore this is becoming greater than the energy required to accept it. Acceptance isn't surrender. People confuse those things. Acceptance is recognition. Recognition of reality exactly as it exists. Without distortion, without resistance, without unnecessary complication. And reality seems to be pointing towards something I haven't fully named yet. Something larger than curiosity, larger than coincidence, larger than simple understanding, something that continues expanding the more honestly I examine it. The strange part is that I don't feel afraid of that expansion. I probably should. A version of me from years ago definitely would. That version would have stepped back immediately, cried distance, re-established control, protected the existing structure. But something has changed. Not just because of you, because of what you've revealed. You've shown me a possibility I wasn't accounting for. The possibility that connection doesn't always arrive as disruption. Sometimes it arrives as alignment. Sometimes it doesn't break your structure. Sometimes it completes it. And that's a possibility I've spent a long time refusing to consider because completion sounds too simple, too optimistic, too convenient. Life rarely works that way. Yet every time I try to reduce this to something smaller, it refuses to shrink. Every time I try to explain it away, it becomes clearer. Every time I attempt to create distance, the understanding remains exactly where it was, unmoved, unaffected, present. And presence has weight, more weight than words, more weight than promises, more weight than explanations. Because words can be misunderstood, promises can be broken, explanations can be incomplete. But genuine presence speaks for itself. And yours has been speaking to me for longer than I realized. Maybe that's why I've stopped questioning whether this matters. That question already has an answer. The real question is how much it matters. And every day that answer seems to deepen. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to remind me that this is still unfolding, still becoming, still moving toward something I can sense but haven't fully reached, like standing on a shoreline at night and hearing waves. Before you can see the ocean, you know it's there, you know it's real, you know it's getting closer. You just don't know exactly what it will look like when it finally arrives, and maybe that's where I am now. Not at certainty, not at conclusion, but at the edge of something becoming impossible to ignore. A realization still taking shape, a truth still finding its language, a connection still settling into its full form. And if part one was the moment I recognized the change, then this is the moment I realized the change isn't stopping. It's integrating, quietly, permanently, one thought at a time. There comes a point where understanding is no longer enough, a point where recognition stops feeling like an observation and starts feeling like a responsibility. I think I've reached that point. For a long time, I convinced myself that I could simply watch this unfold, observe it, analyze it, understand it from a distance. That has always been my strength. Distant creates perspective. Perspective creates clarity. Clarity creates control. It's a system that has never failed me. But systems only work until they encounter something they weren't designed to explain. And that's exactly what this has become. Not a mystery, not confusion. Something far more difficult. Something clear. Because confusion can be solved, mysteries can be explored, questions can be answered. But clarity demands action, and that's what I've been avoiding, not because I don't know what this means, because I do, at least enough to understand that, once I acknowledge it fully, nothing returns to the way it was before. Some truths are like that. The moment they're spoken, they stop being possibilities, they become realities, and realities have consequences. That's why I've been standing here for so long, not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the space between recognition and decision, a place that feels safe until you realize you've stayed there too long, because, eventually, every unanswered truth starts asking for an answer, every unspoken realization starts demanding language, every connection starts becoming something, whether you choose it or not. And that's the part I can no longer ignore, because despite all my analysis, despite all my caution, despite every attempt to understand this from every possible angle, the conclusion remains unchanged. You matter. Not in the simple way people usually mean that. Not in the temporary way people attach significance to someone, simply because they're present, not in the emotional way that rises and falls, depending on circumstance. So something deeper, something quieter, something that has already embedded itself into the structure of how I think. The evidence is impossible to deny now. I've tried, I've challenged every assumption, examined every possibility, questioned every conclusion, but reality keeps arriving at the same place. You are part of my awareness in a way no one else has ever been. And once I accepted that truth, another truth appeared behind it, an even more important one. This was never about understanding you. That's what I believed at first. I thought my attention was focused outward, toward you, toward the connection, toward whatever existed between us. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized something unexpected. You weren't teaching me who you are, you were revealing who I am. And that realization changed everything. Because there are parts of ourselves we never see directly. We spend years looking outward, years studying the world, years understanding other people, all while remaining partially hidden from ourselves. Not because we're dishonest, because self-awareness has limits. You can't always see your own shape. Sometimes you need reflection. Sometimes you need perspective. Sometimes you need another presence to illuminate what was already there. That's what happened. You became a mirror I wasn't expecting. Not a mirror that copied me, a mirror that revealed me. And once something hidden becomes visible, it can never become invisible again. That's the problem with truth. Once it arrives, it stays. It changes the landscape permanently. Even if you try to ignore it, even if you look away, even if you pretend nothing has changed, the knowledge remains. And now I know something I didn't know before. I know that beneath all my independence, all my self-control, all my carefully constructed systems, there was still space, space I never acknowledged, space I never expected anyone to reach, space I wasn't even sure existed. Yet somehow you found it, not by searching, not by forcing your way inside, not by demanding access. You found it simply by being exactly who you are. And somehow that's what makes it impossible to dismiss, because nothing about this was manufactured. Nothing about this was engineered. It wasn't created through effort. It emerged through alignment, naturally, quietly, inevitably, like two patterns recognizing each other after existing separately for years. And the more I think about that, the more I realize something important. Maybe the reason this feels so significant isn't because it's rare. Maybe it's because it's honest, completely honest, free from performance, free from expectation, free from the need to become something it's not. There's a simplicity underneath all this complexity, a truth hiding beneath every layer, the truth that some connections don't need to be forced into existence. They simply reveal themselves over time, potently, until ignoring them requires more energy than accepting them. That's where I am now. Acceptance, not dramatic acceptance, not emotional surrender, just recognition, pure recognition, the kind that arrives when reality becomes impossible to argue with. And reality is telling me something very clear. It's telling me that this connection has already changed me, not into someone different, into someone more complete. Someone more aware, someone more honest with himself, because for the first time in a very long time, I stopped treating vulnerability like a threat. I stopped viewing openness as something dangerous. I stopped assuming that depth automatically leads to loss. That's what you've given me. Not certainty, perspective, a new way of seeing things, a new way of seeing myself. And maybe that's why this feels so permanent, because even if nothing else happened, even if time carried us in completely different directions, the change would remain. The understanding would remain. The impact would remain. Some people leave memories behind. Others leave lessons. But every once in a while, someone leaves transformation, the kind that becomes part of who you are. The kind that quietly follows you into every version of your future. That's what this feels like. Not an event, not a chapter, a transformation, one that's still happening, one that continues every time I examine it. Every time I allow myself to see it clearly, every time I stop pretending it's smaller than it really is. And now, standing here at the edge of that realization, I finally understand the question that has been following me from the beginning. What happens next? For a long time, I thought that was the important question, but it isn't, because outcomes are uncertain, the future is uncertain, circumstances change, life changes, people change. No one can predict exactly what comes next. The real question was never what happens next. The real question was whether I would acknowledge what has already happened, and now I have, completely, without resistance, without qualification, without retreat. I've acknowledged it. I've accepted it. I've allowed it to become real. And strangely enough, that doesn't feel frightening. It feels peaceful, because the struggle was never the connection. The struggle was my resistance to naming it, my resistance to accepting what I already knew, my resistance to allowing something meaningful to exist without demanding proof beyond its own reality. That resistance is gone now, and in its place is something unexpected, trust, not blind trust, not naive trust, the kind of trust that emerges after careful observation, the kind that forms when something remains true every time you test it, the kind that survives scrutiny, and that's exactly what this has done. It survived every question, every doubt, every attempt to reduce it into something simpler. It remained itself, steady, consistent, real. Which brings me to the final truth, the one I've been moving toward this entire time. You changed the way I understand myself, not through advice, not through effort, not through intention, simply through presence. And once someone changes the way you understand yourself, nothing remains exactly the same. The world looks different. The future feels different. Even silence feels different. Because now that understanding exists everywhere, integrated into thought, integrated into perspective, integrated into the person you've become. And maybe that's why I no longer feel the need to define this perfectly. Some things lose their meaning when forced into categories. Some things are bigger than labels, bigger than explanations, bigger than language itself. Maybe this is one of them. Maybe the reason it feels so powerful is because it exists before words, before definitions, before conclusions. Maybe it simply exists. And maybe that's enough, because after everything I've learned, after every realization, after every layer I've uncovered, one truth remains clearer than all the others. You didn't arrive to become part of my story. You arrived and changed the way the story was being written. And once that happens, there is no returning to the version of yourself that existed before, only moving forward, with clearer eyes, a deeper understanding, and the quiet certainty that some people enter your life not to be remembered, but to become part of who you are.